Can you say something about artificial intelligence, AI, and your concerns about it? Yeah, well, this is a very interesting topic. The question of how to build artificial intelligence that isn't going to destroy us is something that I've only begun to pay attention to, and it is a rather deep and consequential problem. I went to a conference in Puerto Rico focused on this issue, organized by the Future of Life Institute, and was brought there by a friend, Elon Musk, who no doubt many of you have heard of. And Elon had recently said publicly that he thought AI was the greatest threat to human survival, perhaps greater than nuclear weapons, and many people took that as an incredibly hyperbolic statement. Now, knowing Elon and knowing how close to the details he's apt to be, I took it as a very interesting diagnosis of a problem, but I wasn't quite sure what I thought about it because I hadn't really spent much time focusing on the progress we've been making in AI and its implications. So I went to this conference in San Juan, held by and for the people who were closest to doing this work. This was not open to the public. I think I was one of maybe 2 or 3 interlopers there who just hadn't been invited but sort of got himself invited. And what was fascinating about that was that this was a collection of people who were very worried, like Elon and others who felt that this is we have to find some way to pull the brakes, even though that seems somewhat hopeless, to the people who were doing the work most energetically and most wanted to convince others not to worry about having to pull the brakes. And what was interesting there is that what I heard outside this conference and what you hear, let's say, on edge.org or in general discussions about the prospects of making real breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, you hear a time frame of 50 to 100 years before anything terribly scary or terribly interesting is going to happen. In this conference, that was almost never the case. Everyone who was still trying to ensure that they were doing this as safely as possible was still conceding that a time frame of 5 or 10 years admitted of rather alarming progress. And so when I came back from that conference, the edge question for 2015 just happened to be on the topic of AI, so I wrote a short piece distilling what my view now was. Perhaps I'll just read that. It won't take too long, and hopefully it won't bore you. Can we avoid a digital apocalypse? It seems increasingly likely that we will one day build machines that possess superhuman intelligence. We need only continue to produce better computers, which we will unless we destroy ourselves or meet our end some other way. We already know that it's possible for mere matter to acquire, quote, general intelligence, the ability to learn new concepts and employ them in unfamiliar contexts, because the 1,200 cc's of salty porridge inside our heads has managed it. There's no reason to believe that a suitably advanced digital computer couldn't do the same. It's often said that the near-term goal is to build a machine that possesses, quote, human-level intelligence. But unless we specifically emulate a human brain, with all its limitations, this is a false goal. The computer on which I'm writing these words already possesses superhuman powers of memory and calculation. It also has potential access to most of the world's information. Unless we take extraordinary steps to hobble it, any future artificial general intelligence, known as AGI, will exceed human performance on every task for which it is considered a source of intelligence in the first place. Whether such a machine would necessarily be conscious is an open question. But conscious or not, an AGI might very well develop goals incompatible with our own. Just how sudden and lethal this parting of the ways might be is now a subject of much colorful speculation. So just to make things perfectly clear here, all you have to grant to get your fears up and running is that we will continue to make progress in hardware and software design unless we destroy ourselves some other way, and that there's nothing magical about the wetware we have running inside our heads, and that an intelligent machine could be built of other material. Once you grant those two things, which I think everyone who has thought about the problem will grant. I can't imagine a scientist not granting that, one, we're going to make progress in computer design unless something terrible happens, and two, that there's nothing magical about biological material where intelligence is concerned. Once you've granted those two propositions, you now will be hard-pressed to find some handhold with which to resist your slide into real concern about where this is all going. So back to the text. One way of glimpsing the coming risk is to imagine what might happen if we accomplished our aims and built a superhuman AGI that behaved exactly as intended. Such a machine would quickly free us from drudgery and even from the inconvenience of doing most intellectual work. What would follow under our current political order? There's no law of economics that guarantees that human beings will find jobs in the presence of every possible technological advance. Once we built the perfect labor-saving device, the cost of manufacturing new devices would approach the cost of raw materials. Absent a willingness to immediately put this new capital at the service of all humanity, a few of us would enjoy unimaginable wealth, and the rest would be free to starve. Even in the presence of a truly benign AGI, we could find ourselves slipping back to a state of nature, policed by drones. And what would the Russians or the Chinese do if they learned that some company in Silicon Valley was about to develop a superintelligent AGI? This machine would, by definition, be capable of waging war, terrestrial and cyber, with unprecedented power. How would our adversaries behave on the brink of such a winner-take-all scenario? Mere rumors of an AGI might cause our species to go berserk. It is sobering to admit that chaos seems a probable outcome, even in the best-case scenario, in which the AGI remained perfectly obedient. But of course we cannot assume the best-case scenario. In fact, quote, the control problem, the solution to which would guarantee obedience in any advanced AGI, appears quite difficult to solve. Imagine, for instance, that we build a computer that is no more intelligent than the average team of researchers at Stanford or MIT. But because it functions on a digital timescale, it runs 1,000,000 times faster than the minds that built it. Set it humming for a week and it would perform 20,000 years of human-level intellectual work. What are the chances that such an entity would remain content to take direction from us? And how could we confidently predict the thoughts and actions of an autonomous agent that sees more deeply into the past, present, and future than we do? The fact that we seem to be hastening towards some sort of digital apocalypse poses several intellectual and ethical challenges. For instance, in order to have any hope that a superintelligent AGI would have values commensurate with our own, we would have to instill those values in it, or otherwise get it to emulate us. But whose values should count? Should everyone get a vote in creating the utility function of our new colossus? If nothing else, the invention of an AGI would force us to resolve some very old and boring arguments in moral philosophy. And perhaps I don't need to spell this out any further, but it's interesting that once you imagine having to build values into a superintelligent AGI, you then realize that you need to get straight about what you think is good. And I think the advent of this technology would cut through moral relativism like a laser. I mean, who is going to want to engineer into this thing the values of theocracy, traditional religious authoritarianism? You want to build homophobia and intolerance toward free speech into a machine that makes tens of thousands of years of human-level intellectual progress every time it cycles? I don't think so. Even designing self-driving cars presents potential ethical problems that we need to get straight about. Any self-driving car needs some algorithm by which to rank order bad outcomes. So if you want a car that will avoid a child who dashes in front of it in the road, perhaps by driving up on the sidewalk, you also want a car that will avoid the people on the sidewalk or preferentially hit a mailbox instead of a baby carriage, right? So you need some intelligent sorting of outcomes here. Well, these are moral decisions. Do you want a car that is unbiased with respect to the age and size of people or the color of their skin? Would you like a car that was more likely to run over white people than people of color? That may seem like a peculiar question, but if you do psychological tests, say trolley problem tests on liberals, and this is the one psychological experiment that I'm aware of where liberals come out looking worse than conservatives reliably, if you test them on whether or not they would be willing to sacrifice one life to save 5 or one life to save 100, and you give subtle clues as to the color of the people involved. If you say that LeBron belongs to the Harlem Boys Choir, and there's some scenario under which he can be sacrificed to save Chip and his friends who study music at Juilliard, they simply won't take a consequentialist approach to the problem. They will not sacrifice a black life to save any number of white lives. Whereas if you reverse the variables, they will sacrifice a white life to save black lives rather reliably. Now, conservatives, strangely, are unbiased in this paradigm, which is to say, colorblind. Well, do we like bias here? Do you want a self-driving car that preferentially avoids people of color? You have to decide. We either build it one way or the other. So this is an interesting phenomenon where technology is going to force us to admit to ourselves that we know right from wrong in a way that many people imagine isn't possible. Okay, back to the text. However, a true AGI would probably acquire new values, or at least develop novel and perhaps dangerous near-term goals. What steps might a superintelligence take to ensure its continued survival, or access to computational resources? Whether the behavior of such a machine would remain compatible with human flourishing might be the most important question our species ever asks. The problem, however, is that only a few of us seem to be in a position to think this question through. Indeed, the moment of truth might arrive amid circumstances that are disconcertingly informal and inauspicious. Picture 10 young men in a room, several of them with undiagnosed Asperger's, drinking Red Bull and wondering whether to flip a switch. Should any single company or research group be able to decide the fate of humanity? The question nearly answers itself. And yet it is beginning to seem likely that some small number of smart people will one day roll these dice, and the temptation will be understandable. We confront problems, Alzheimer's disease, climate change, economic instability, for which superhuman intelligence could offer a solution. In fact, the only thing nearly as scary as building an AGI is the prospect of not building one. Nevertheless, those who are closest to doing this work have the greatest responsibility to anticipate its dangers. Yes, other fields pose extraordinary risks, but the difference between AGI and something like synthetic biology is that in the latter, the most dangerous innovations, such as germline mutation, are not the most tempting, commercially or ethically. With AGI, the most powerful methods, such as recursive self-improvement, are precisely those that entail the most risk. We seem to be in the process of building a god. Now would be a good time to wonder whether it will or even can be a good one. I guess I should probably explain this final notion of recursive self-improvement. The idea is that once you build an AGI that is superhuman, well then the way that it will truly take off is if it is given or develops an ability to improve its own code. You just imagine something, again, that could make literally tens of thousands of years of human-level intellectual progress in days or even minutes, improving itself, not only learning more, but learning more about how to learn and improving its ability to learn. Then you have this exponential takeoff function where this thing stands in relation to us intellectually, the way we stand in relation to chickens and sea urchins and snails. Now, this may sound like a crazy thing to worry about. It isn't. Again, the only assumptions are that we will continue to make progress and that there's nothing magical about biological substrate where intelligence is concerned. And again, I'm agnostic as to whether or not such a machine would by definition be conscious. So let's assume it's not conscious. So what? You're still talking about something that will have the functional power of a god, whether or not the lights are on. Can the form of human consciousness be distinguished from its contents, or are the two identical? And that's an interesting question. I think it's, insofar as I understand it, there are a couple different ways I can interpret what you've said there, but I think human consciousness clearly has a form both conscious and unconscious. When you're talking about the contents of consciousness, you're talking about what is actually appearing before the light of consciousness. That is what is available to attention in each moment, what can be noticed. But there's much that can't be noticed, which is structuring what can. So the contents are dependent upon unconscious processes, which are noticeably human in that the contents they deliver are human. So, for instance, an example I often cite is our ability to understand and produce language. The ability to follow grammatical rules, to notice when they're broken, All of these processes are unconscious, and yet this is not something that dogs do. It's not something that chimps do. We're the only ones we know to do it, and all of this gets tuned in a very particular way in each person's case. For instance, I'm totally insensitive to the grammatical rules of Japanese. When Japanese is spoken in my presence, I don't hear much of anything linguistic. So the difference between being an effortless parser of meaning and syntax in English and being a little better than a chimpanzee in the presence of Japanese, that difference is, again, unconscious, yet determining the contents of consciousness. So there are both unconscious and conscious ways in which consciousness, in our case, is demonstrably human. And I don't really think you can talk about the humanness of consciousness beyond that. Because for me, consciousness is simply the fact that it's like something to have an experience of the world. The fact that there's a qualitative character to anything. That's consciousness. And if our computers ever acquire that, well, then our computers will be conscious.